Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we're going to be talking about a solved case from Massachusetts when a young teenage boy just mysteriously disappeared after attending a high school dance one night in the late 60s. His family quickly jumped into action and went out searching for him, confused as to why he wouldn't have returned home. But it wouldn't take long for the answer to that question to be revealed, as just the following day, his dead body was found. He'd been horrifically murdered, despite the fact that his homicide was being investigated by 3 different police forces, and despite identifying some top suspects very early on in the case. Unfortunately, years and years and years would pass by with no arrests made and no closure for the family. Police were pretty sure they knew exactly who was responsible for this crime, but they just didn't have the evidence to prove it. That was until more than 4 decades later, when finally an individual started to talk. Detectives got a confession from someone who claimed that they were present when this teenage boy was abducted and murdered. But would this confession be enough to bring the perpetrators to justice? Join me as we delve into the twisted case of John McCabe. So for this week's case, we are going back approaching 56 years ago now to the fall of 1969 in Tewksbury, which is a town located in Middlesex County in the state of Massachusetts in the US. And this is John Joseph McCabe. He was a teenage boy who lived in Tewksbury with his family. John McCabe was born on the 13th of March 1954, making him 15 years old at the time that this case occurred. His parents were Bill and Evelyn McCabe, and John was one of 3 children. He had an older sister named Debbie, who was 17, and a little sister named Roberta, who was just 6. So John was the middle child, and the McCabe family just seemed to be a very normal, hardworking, happy family of 5. Bill McCabe worked as an engineer, whilst his wife Evelyn had a job in a school library, and they seemed to be very content and very settled in Tewksbury. Prior to this case taking place, Tewksbury was just known to be a very nice, friendly, safe town in Massachusetts. Crime rates were very low, and there was a real sense of community there, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. So it felt like the perfect place for Bill and Evelyn McCabe to raise their family. John McCabe was described as being a bit of a cheeky young lad. His sisters said that he was very much the jokester of the family. He was always pulling pranks, trying to make people laugh. Debbie actually recalled how one time John had pranked her by filling her closet with grasshoppers. So she literally opened her closet door and all of these grasshoppers came jumping out. He was very, very active and outdoorsy, always playing outside in the woods, riding his bike, getting his hands dirty. He very much looked up to his father Bill and his job as an engineer. He loved learning about engineering from his father, and he would spend a lot of his time in the family garage. He would be in there with all of the tools trying to fix something or put something together. John also loved animals, and he was very, very kind and caring with animals. In fact, his mother Evelyn said that one time John literally brought this goose home, this huge goose that he'd found injured. And yeah, he just walked in the house with this goose one day and decided that he was going to help nurse it back to health, take care of it, which I can't lie, did tickle me a lot when I was researching this case. Just the thought of this young boy walking through the door with a goose, that really made me laugh. But I mean, how sweet is that as well? Again, just shows how caring John was. John was, of course, a student. He attended the Tewksbury Junior High School, and as far as I'm aware, he did well in school. He had friends, he loved to be sociable, and in fact, in the lead up to this case taking place, John was very, very excited at the prospect of attending an upcoming school dance. A school dance was being held at the Knights of Columbus Hall in Tewksbury on the evening of the 26th of September 1969. It was a Friday evening, and John was desperate to go to this dance, so he pleaded and pleaded and pleaded with his mother Evelyn for permission to attend. I think Evelyn was a bit unsure at first about letting him go, but I mean, seeing how desperate her son was. She agreed, she said yes, and she watched as John got all ready for the dance that Friday evening in excitement. He had a shower, he did his hair, he put on nice clothes, he borrowed his father's aftershave, even though he didn't actually shave, he didn't have facial hair yet, bless him. And then he left his home, said goodbye to his family, and began the walk to the hall where the dance was being held, because obviously he didn't drive, he was 15 years old, so he had to walk there. He arrived at the dance, as far as we know, he had a really good time, and then the dance was due to end around 11 p.m. that evening, so John's parents were expecting him to be home at around midnight at the latest. However, midnight rolled around and there was no sign of John. His mother Evelyn was waiting up, looking out of the window, listening out for the door, expecting him to walk through it at any moment, but that moment never came. John didn't come back, which was very strange. I mean, it wasn't a long walk to the Knights of Columbus Hall. There was no reason why he shouldn't have been back by now, so why wasn't he? What had happened to John during his journey? It wasn't long before that panic started to set in for Evelyn. She just seemed to have a gut feeling that something wasn't right here, like mother's intuition. And so in the early hours of the morning, she left the house, got in her car, and started driving along the route that John would have taken to get back home, just looking around for him. She was looking along the street, shouting his name out of the car window, but she had no luck. There was absolutely no sign of her son. And so she went back home, I believe called the police to report her son as missing, and Evelyn said that she spent that whole night praying, just praying to God that her boy would come home safe and sound. But tragically, Evelyn's prayers went unanswered when just the day after John's disappearance, police informed the McCabe family that the dead body of a young teen had just been found, and they believed it was their son, 15-year-old John McCabe. Around 9 a.m. that morning, the morning of the 27th of September 1969, two young boys were walking through this vacant lot off of Maple Street in Lowell, Massachusetts. Lowell is a city that's only about 5 miles away from Tewksbury, where the McCabes live. These two young boys were walking through this lot, I think looking for frogs that they could catch or something, but what they really found that day was something far, far more sinister. These little children stumbled upon the most terrifying scene. They stumbled upon the body of a teenage boy, later identified of course as being 15-year-old John McCabe, who had vanished the evening prior following the school dance. So I imagine feeling very, very scared, these two young boys knew that they had to get help, and they actually managed to flag down a police officer who I think was driving by. They informed him of what they had just found, and emergency services soon descended on the scene. John's body was lying face down on the ground in this lot, and it was clear just from looking at his body that he'd been the victim of a truly terrifying ordeal. Of course, this was a homicide. It was clear that John had been murdered, and when he was found, he was actually tied up. His killer or killers had used rope to restrain him. His hands were tied behind his back, his ankles had been tied together. Horrifyingly, he also had duct tape covering both his eyes and his mouth, so he would have been unable to scream, and he also had rope around his neck too. And apparently this rope around his neck connected to his ankles, which obviously alluded to his cause of death. It was later confirmed that his cause of death was asphyxiation via strangulation, via this rope. I mean, it was just horrifying. Again, absolutely terrifying to imagine the fear that this teenage boy, this child, was subjected to. John McCabe had just simply been trying to walk home that night, walk back home to his loving family from the school dance, when he was clearly abducted and murdered in such a cruel way, and his body just left in this lot. And for what? What on earth could have been the motive for such a vile crime against an innocent, caring 15-year-old? Well, that was obviously a job for the police to determine. Following the discovery of John's body, his family were informed of the devastating news that he had been found dead, found murdered, and his father Bill actually had to be the one to positively identify his son's body. A homicide investigation was swiftly launched, spanning across 3 different police departments actually. It not only involved the Lowell Police, but also the Tewksbury Police and the Massachusetts State Police, so all hands were on deck here. As I said, they descended on the scene on the vacant lot in Lowell where John's body was discovered. They began collecting potential evidence from the scene, so this obviously included the rope, the tape, John's clothing and the shoes that he was wearing. Now unfortunately this was 1969, obviously a time before DNA technology was really a thing. They did dust for potential fingerprints of the perpetrator on evidence collected, but apparently no usable fingerprints were found, so in terms of forensic evidence in the case, police had none. And so, in a bid for leads, the police appealed to the public for information. As you can imagine, a crime such as this one spread like wildfire throughout Tewksbury and Lowell because, I mean, as I said earlier, this was previously thought to be a very safe, secure area to live in. Crimes like this just didn't happen here. They were unheard of. So when John was murdered, news of his case spread fast, resulting in a couple of significant tips coming into the investigation team. One tip which they received came from a man who said that on the night of John's disappearance and murder, he recalled having seen a maroon-coloured 1965 Chevrolet Impala car parked right by the crime scene, right by the vacant lot in Lowell where John's body was discovered the following day. So thinking that this car may have belonged to the killer, they decided to tell the police about this sighting. And they also received some tips from a couple of other local people, which would actually lead the police to identifying some potential suspects in the case. They received information that on the night in question, John McCabe hadn't actually walked to the school dance like the police and his family previously thought he had. Well, I think he walked some of the way, but as he was walking, he was hitchhiking. He was thumbing for a lift, and he was given one. The tipsters claimed that 2 other local teens that went to the same high school as John had picked him up, Michael Ferrer and Nancy Williams, both aged 16 and who were actually dating at the time. They were a couple. Apparently they'd seen John walking to the dance. They obviously knew him from school, and so they stopped next to him and offered him a ride, and he accepted, and that was how he got to the dance. So with this information, police decided to go and speak to Mike Ferrer and Nancy Williams, and they admitted that, yeah, sure enough, they had given him a lift, and they claimed that the last time they saw John McCabe was when they dropped him off at the dance. Mike said that he knew of John. They weren't friends or anything, he just knew him very briefly from school, and he claimed that he had no idea what happened to John after he left that dance, and he had no idea who killed him. However, the police quickly became very skeptical, shall we say, about Mike Ferrer and his story, because when they asked him what else he had done that night, asked him for his movements after he and Nancy dropped John off at the dance, he claimed that he left his girlfriend Nancy and he went to hang out with another friend of his named Walter Shelley, who was a couple of years older than Mike. He was around 18 years old, I believe. He said that he and Walter actually drove in Walter's car to Lowell in Massachusetts that evening to buy some beers. They were just kind of driving around drinking beers, but the reason why police became very suspicious about this was because they learned that Walter Shelley just so happened to drive a maroon-coloured 1965 Chevrolet Impala, the exact same car that a previous witness had described seeing parked by the crime scene on the night of John's murder. Was it just a coincidence, or were these 2 boys, Walter Shelley and Mike Ferrer, involved in the killing of John McCabe? We know that Mike knew John from school, we know that he gave him a lift to the dance that night, and we now know that Walter Shelley drove a car that was identical to what police believe the killer may have been driving. So, upon receiving these tips, police now had 2 viable suspects in the case. So police brought both teenagers in for questioning. Just just like Mike Ferrer, Walter Shelley too denied having any part in the murder of John McCabe. However, they both underwent, I believe, several polygraph tests and they both failed. The examiners concluded that the results of the polygraphs indicated that both Mike and Walter were, quote, lying in all vital areas. But, of course, a failed polygraph test is not solid evidence at all, and so they conducted a search of Walter Shelley's car, his maroon Chevy Impala, to see if they could find anything which linked him to the crime in there. However, nothing was really found. So despite the police's suspicions that Walter Shelley and Mike Ferrer may have been the ones responsible for John McCabe's murder, they just didn't have any hard proof to well, do just that to prove it. They were identified as people of interest pretty early on in the investigation, but their case against them was based on circumstantial evidence, if that, meaning that the police would be unable to obtain an arrest warrant. Just the year following John's murder, apparently both boys, both men, I should say, really, they were adults by this point, they both joined the armed forces, so they kind of moved away from the state for a period of time. And unfortunately, the case of John McCabe kind of started to go cold following this. Police did look into other people, other teenagers, other men. They looked into sex offenders and paedophiles in case John's murder was sexually motivated, but they were never able to definitively link anyone to the crime, much to the disappointment and heartbreak of the McCabe family. Of course, John's sisters and his parents, Bill and Evelyn, were just devastated that it seemed as though no one was going to face punishment for taking John's life, but they never let John go. His mother Evelyn said that for years after his killing, they continued setting a place for him at the dinner table. They continued praying for justice. His father Bill actually started writing a book about his son, about his life and his death. I think it was a way for him to kind of channel his grief and get it out, and they never ever gave up. For years and years after their son was killed, the McCabes constantly checked in with the police, especially Bill McCabe. He was always ringing, asking for updates, asking if there were any developments, if any arrests had been made. He would not allow his son's case to be forgotten, and neither would his little sister Roberta. She actually wrote letters to TV shows, I guess in an effort to try and get the media involved and spread awareness of her brother's case. She wrote letters to the police. Again, no one was giving up. The McCabes were going to stop at nothing to get answers, no matter how long it took. And it did take an extremely long time for there to be any sort of movement in the case. Decades started to go by, in fact, with no news whatsoever. But then came the year 2000. So this is 31 long years after the crime, when finally there was something, there was a development. It was November of the year 2000 when John's father, Bill McCabe, was contacted by an old school friend of his son's named Jack Ward. Of course, by this point, 31 years later, Jack was a fully grown adult man, and he'd kind of always remained in touch with John's father over the years. Bill would actually ask Jack to, please keep an ear out. If you hear anything relating to John's murder, please let me know. And Jack always promised Bill that he would, but Jack never did hear anything until 2000, when he attended a barbecue or a cookout that a friend of his was hosting, and this friend had invited a load of his acquaintances to this cookout, one of which just happened to be none other than Michael Ferrer, one of the old suspects in John's case, who by this point in 2000 would have been around like 47 years old. Jack said that everyone at the cookout was just sitting around eating, drinking alcohol, and at one point Jack claimed that Mike Ferrer turned to him and he said, completely out of the blue, quote, "I know who killed John McCabe." Now, Jack didn't actually respond to Mike at first. I can imagine that he was a bit stunned by this. He probably didn't know what to say. And so Mike said it again. He said, "I know who killed John." And when Jack eventually asked, well, who? Mike responded that it was Walter. Walter Shelley, the other teenage boy who had also been looked at as a suspect back in 1969, and the one that Mike claimed that he was with on the evening that John McCabe died. So Jack asked Mike, well, why? Why would Walter have wanted John dead? And Mike said that it was because of Marla Shiner. You see, back in 1969, when this case occurred, Walter Shelley was dating a young girl named Marla Shiner. And I say young girl because Marla was literally a child. She was, I believe, around 13 years old. And bear in mind, Walter Shelley was around 18 at this time. And apparently it was rumoured that Marla actually had a bit of a crush on John McCabe, and that John had a little bit of a crush on her too. Obviously he was more around her age, he was 15, and I think they went to school together, and sources state that they had chatted at the school dance on the night that John was murdered. And the thing about Walter Shelley was that he was known to be a very, very, very possessive and jealous person. In the years after John was killed, he and Marla actually ended up getting married to each other. However, this marriage didn't last because Marla said that Walter was very abusive. He was physically abusive, he was controlling, and again, very, very jealous. And yeah, Mike Ferrer said at the cookout that that was Walter's motive, his reason for killing John. He was jealous that Marla had a bit of a crush on him, he was angry, and he wanted to take revenge on John, I guess. And so upon learning this from Mike Ferrer, Jack Ward did as he promised, and he passed this information on to John's father, Bill McCabe. And Bill immediately contacted the police about this supposed confession from Mike Ferrer at the cookout. Now, it doesn't really appear as though the police took this report very seriously at first. They didn't really do anything about it initially, but after a lot of pushing from Bill McCabe, him continuing to regularly check in and ask for updates, finally in 2003 they took action and they went to speak to a now 50-year-old Michael Ferrer about this statement that he had made at the cookout regarding Walter Shelley murdering John. By this point, Ferrer was living in the state of New Hampshire, so he'd moved about an hour away from Massachusetts, and he was actually married to Nancy Williams, the same girl that he was dating back in 1969. They'd married by this time. Anyway, the police went to speak to Mike. They asked him about this admission that he'd made to Jack Ward at the cookout a couple of years earlier, and he completely denied it. He said that it was Jack that was going around saying Walter Shelley was the killer, Walter Shelley was the killer. He said that Jack was drunk and that he, Mike, had been drinking too, and so he said to Jack, yeah, he probably did do it just to shut him up, but that he wasn't the one who brought up Walter Shelley in the first place, it was Jack who did. And he also claimed that he never said anything about Walter's motive supposedly being to do with Marla Shiner, his jealousy with Marla. That was Jack that came up with that theory. Police didn't really believe Mike Ferrer. They still strongly believe that he knew way more about this crime than he had always let on, that he was involved with Walter Shelley. But once again, the evidence just wasn't there to support this, and so once again the police hit a dead end and the case remained unsolved. About 4 years after this, in 2007, Jerry Leone, a new district attorney in Middlesex County, began looking into John's homicide. He dived into the case files to see if he could perhaps help advance this cold case investigation, and Jerry did actually spot something in the files that he thought might be worth looking further into. He went back over the statements that previous investigators had taken from Michael Ferrer back in 2003, and he noticed that when Michael Ferrer went through his account of his movements on the night of John's death again, he mentioned a new name. He mentioned someone that he'd never mentioned before. So as we know, Mike Ferrer's story of that night had always been that he and his girlfriend Nancy Williams had dropped John McCabe at the school dance, and that after this he left Nancy to go and hang out with Walter Shelley, and they drove in Walter's car to Lowell to buy some beer. They had nothing to do with John's death, and he didn't even see John after he gave him the lift to the dance that night. However, years and years later in 2003, Mike suddenly seemed to add to this story. He mentioned in his statement in 2003 that actually a third guy was with him and Walter that night, a guy named Edward Allen Brown, who was good friends with Ferrer and Shelley back in 1969. At the time he was 17, so now he was in his early 50s. Edward Allen Brown was of course never interviewed back when the crime occurred because again his name had never been mentioned before, and so as you can imagine, when Jerry Leone came across his name in Mike Ferrera's new statement, he was very keen to speak to him and get his account of that night. So they tracked Brown down, they brought him in for an interview, and this interview did immediately throw up alarm bells, to be honest, because when they started asking Brown questions about the crime and about John McCabe, he actually denied having ever even heard of John's murder. He said that he had no clue who John McCabe was and he'd never even heard of his homicide, which police just knew was an outright lie because Edward Allen Brown lived in Tewkesbury at the time that John was killed. He actually lived not far from the McCabe family, and as I mentioned earlier, news of John's murder spread like wildfire after his body was found. Everyone in the community knew about this crime. It was impossible not to know about it because it was all anyone was talking about. It had shocked the community that much, so they knew that that was just a load of crap. No way was he completely unaware of John's killing. And actually his own wife, Edward Allen Brown's own wife, confirmed that. She confirmed that her husband had lied. After the police took this statement from Brown, his wife actually contacted the detectives herself, and she told them that her husband did know John McCabe and that over 2 decades ago he had actually confessed to her that he had been involved in the murder of a young boy. It doesn't seem as though she ever told anyone about this confession at the time. Maybe she just didn't take it seriously at first, who knows? But yeah, she told the police that her husband was lying. However, once again, I sound like a broken record at this point, but once again, this wasn't solid evidence. The fact that his wife said he was lying was very damning, but it wasn't solid evidence, so police were still powerless to do anything. Again, years passed by with nothing really happening in the case, but it was in 2011 when new life was injected into the investigation as the case was handed over to new detective Linda Coughlin. It had been 42 years since John's murder, but despite this, Linda was so determined to finally solve this crime, finally get answers for the McCabe family and get justice for John. John's mother, Evelyn, said that only when Detective Coughlin became involved in her son's case did it really kind of take off, to be honest, because again, she just came with this sheer determination to solve it, and Detective Coughlin believed that her best bet at doing so was through Edward Allen Brown. His wife had already said that he was lying, so was there a possibility that he might admit to that he might crack and confess? So in 2011, Detective Coughlin went to speak to Brown, interview him herself. He once again stuck to his original story that he didn't know John McCabe, he didn't know anything about his death, and so Detective Coughlin asked Brown to undergo a polygraph test, a lie detector test, which he failed miserably. Detective Coughlin actually said that he failed every single aspect of this polygraph test, and so she basically said to Brown something along the lines of, look, this doesn't look good for you. Clearly you are not being truthful. You failed this lie detector. Your own wife has told us you're lying. Clearly you know a lot more about what happened to John than you are letting on, so either you can keep lying and potentially face some very serious murder charges, or you can finally be honest with us. And with that, Edward Allen Brown cracked. He finally confessed that yes, he did know John McCabe, and he told Linda Coughlin that he knew what happened to John on the night of the 26th/27th of September 1969. He knew how John had died because he was present when it happened. He was there when John McCabe was killed. Edward Allen Brown's account of that night is as follows. So he claimed that on the evening of the 26th of September, he was picked up at his house by Walter Shelley and Michael Ferrer at around 10:30 p.m. And they told Brown that they needed his help with something. They started driving away in Walter's maroon Chevy Impala, and they informed Brown that they were going to go and find 15-year-old John McCabe and essentially teach him a lesson for talking or flirting or whatever with Walter's girlfriend, Marla Shiner. So they were driving along the streets looking for John, and eventually they found him. I believe after he'd left the dance and he began the walk back to his home that night, they spotted John on the side of the road, pulled the car over, got out, and they dragged John into Walter's vehicle and drove away. They kidnapped him. Walter Shelley was driving, Michael Ferrer was in the front seat next to him, and Brown and John were in the back seat. Brown said that he was holding John, he was restraining him, whilst Michael Ferrer was turning around and hitting him, and John, obviously terrified, was crying. He was trying to shield his face from Michael slapping him. He was begging the boys to let him go, but of course they didn't. They drove John to that vacant lot in Lowell, Massachusetts. They forced him out of the car, and Brown said that it was there where he and Walter held John down whilst Michael tied his wrists together, tied his ankles together, and then Brown watched as the two boys started assaulting John. They taped his eyes and his mouth shut. They wrapped the rope around his neck and attached it to his ankles. Brown said that John was struggling to try and free himself. He was wriggling around on the ground, squirming, and then they said to him words to the effect of, "That will teach you to leave Marla alone, not to mess with Marla anymore." And then all three of them jumped back into the car and they left. They just left John in that lot alone. Once they got back in the car, Brown said that the three of them were driving around for about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, just drinking beer, probably laughing and joking about what they'd just done. And then eventually Brown suggested that they should probably go and check on John at the lot. They should check that he's been able to get up and free himself because they had left him restrained in the rope. However, when they got back to the lot, Brown said that Shelley and Ferrer went to check on John and he was dead. He wasn't breathing. He'd died from the rope ligature around his neck. Brown claimed that they never intended to kill him, that Walter and Mike only intended to rough him up, I guess, to again teach him a lesson, but the taping of his mouth and the rope ligature that they put around his neck had caused him to asphyxiate to death. And so they all quickly left, and the three boys agreed with each other. They made a pact that they would never tell anyone about what had happened that night. And Edward Allen Brown never did tell anyone, apart from his wife, clearly. He never told anyone about what he, Walter Shelley, and Michael Ferrer did on that fateful night back in September of 1969. But now he'd finally given this confession to Detective Linda Coughlin, which was the breakthrough that the police desperately needed to finally move in and apprehend John's killers. In April of 2011, approaching 42 years after the crime, all three men were arrested in relation to the killing of John McCabe. Edward Allen Brown was arrested and charged with manslaughter, and Michael Ferrer and Walter Shelley were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Now, Edward Allen Brown ended up making a deal with the prosecutors whereby he essentially wouldn't be punished for his part in this crime. He wouldn't face jail time so long as he agreed to testify against both Ferrer and Shelley should their cases go to trial, and he took this deal. The two men went to trial separately, with Michael Ferrer going to trial first. His trial began in January of 2013, and he was actually charged as a juvenile. He was in his 50s by this point, but of course he was technically a child when he committed this crime. He was 16 years old. The prosecution presented their case to the jury, and they had a number of witnesses called to testify, including Detective Coughlin, John's father, Bill McCabe. Heartbreakingly, when Bill was asked on the stand how old his son was when he died, he replied, quote, "He was 15 years, 6 months and 2 weeks. They had Jack Ward called as a witness. He testified about the comments that Michael Ferrer had made at the cookout in the year 2000. It seemed as though Mike had actually confessed to numerous people over the years, because they had another person, an old friend or acquaintance of Michael Ferrer's named Elaine Sutton, testify during the trial. She told the court about one occasion when she was in a car with Mike, and he started talking to her about the fact that he was being looked at as a suspect in the John McCabe killing. And when Elaine said, well, why would they look at you as a suspect, Mike replied that it was because he didn't have a very solid alibi for the night in question. And when Elaine said something along the lines of, well, I wonder who really did kill him, Mike replied, I did. And then soon after he said, oh, I was just joking, just kidding. Very, very strange thing to joke about, but anyway. But of course, the main witness, the star witness for the prosecution was Edward Allen Brown. He was the real crux of the prosecution's case against Michael Ferrer. Much of their argument relied on his testimony, to be honest. However, Edward Allen Brown's testimony really did not go to plan for the prosecution. He talked the jury through his account of that fateful night, the account that we've already discussed. However, when Edward Allen Brown was cross-examined by the defense team over the course of 2 days, he just kind of crumbled. He seemed to start changing his story slightly. He was very, very inconsistent in what he was saying, and the defense essentially alleged that he was fed information about John's murder by the police and the prosecution. He was essentially fed the story that he gave about that night rather than it actually coming from his own memory. And Edward Allen Brown, clearly under pressure in the witness box, kind of just ended up agreeing with the defense attorney. The defense alleged that Detective Linda Coughlin essentially coerced Edward Allen Brown into making a false confession following his failed polygraph test, convincing him that he must have been there that night, he must have been present when John died, because otherwise he wouldn't have failed this lie detector. And so Brown just agreed with her. He just said that he was. Of course, Detective Coughlin strongly refuted this, said that Brown was not coerced into making a false confession at all. But yeah, it didn't help that, again, during his cross-examination, Brown crumbled and essentially admitted that he had lied under oath because his story was inconsistent. The defense were able to poke holes in it, and therefore they claimed that he couldn't be relied upon, because Brown admitted himself that he would change his story when he was scared or nervous. He was the main witness in the prosecution's case, and yet he was completely unreliable because he kept changing his account. Walter Shelley's ex-wife, Marla Shiner, was also called to testify during the trial. As we know, she was just 13 years old at the time of John's murder in 1969, and while she had previously told the police in a statement that she and Walter Shelley were dating back when John McCabe was killed, when it came to the trial, when she testified during the trial, she now claimed that that wasn't the case, that they didn't start dating until after John's death. It kind of seemed like during the trial that she was trying to separate herself from the crime as much as possible, didn't want to acknowledge that the motive behind John's murder may have been to do with her and Walter Shelley's jealousy. guilty. So by denying that they were a couple back in September of 1969, it kind of made the prosecution's case crumble even more, because obviously it was their argument that Walter Shelley and Michael Ferrer committed this crime because Walter essentially wanted revenge on John for flirting and talking to his girlfriend, and now Marla's testimony had poked holes in that motive. That, paired with the fact that Edward Allen Brown's story was torn apart by the defense and the fact that there was no physical evidence, really meant that by the end of Michael Ferrer's trial, the prosecution's case just wasn't a strong one at all anymore. And to the absolute heartbreak of the McCabe family, when the jury was sent off to deliberate, they returned with a verdict of not guilty. They just didn't believe that the prosecution had proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael Ferrer had involvement in the murder of John McCabe, and so he was acquitted, which again was just utterly devastating for John's family. They'd waited more than 4 decades for justice for their son, finally thinking that they were going to get it, and now Michael Ferrer had been found not guilty. John's father Bill was actually too scared, too anxious to sit in the courtroom when the verdict was read out, so he was in another room waiting to hear what the jury had decided. And when he was informed that they'd acquitted Ferrer, he just broke down. His daughter Roberta said that he just couldn't stop crying. It completely shattered him. For years and years and years, he'd worked so hard, done everything that he could to keep pushing and pushing and pushing the police not to give up on his boy's case, and it was all in vain. And Bill McCabe just couldn't take it. He couldn't take the heartbreak of this verdict, and just 4 days after the end of the trial, he passed away, aged 85, after suffering a heart attack. And his wife Evelyn strongly believes, without a doubt, that stress killed her husband. The stress of the verdict is what caused his heart attack, because he just couldn't live with the devastation any longer. It was too agonizing for him. But the fight for justice wasn't over yet. Whilst Michael Ferrer had been acquitted, the police still wanted to go ahead and prosecute Walter Shelley for this crime. They couldn't convict one of the suspected killers, but maybe they could get the other one, convict the other one, and then that would be at least half of the justice for John and the McCabe family. I mean, if anything, perhaps the fact that they failed the first time around might help the prosecution, help them to highlight the mistakes they made in their first trial and where they needed to improve their arguments. Walter Shelley went to trial about 7 months after Mike Ferrer did in September of 2013. Despite the fact that he crumbled in the witness box during the first trial, Edward Allen Brown was still called as the main witness in the second one, only this time, thankfully, he was a lot more confident. He was a lot more confident and assured in his demeanour and his answers. His story was more consistent and more believable, to be honest. Walter's defence basically said the same thing during his trial that Michael's defence argued, that Brown couldn't be trusted, that he was unreliable, but the prosecution responded by essentially saying that Edward Allen Brown had nothing to gain by lying. What would he get out of lying about this? You know, by giving this account, he was implicating himself too. He was confessing that he too was involved in the death of this teenage boy. Why would he do that unless it was the truth? The trial of Walter Shelley lasted for about a week, I believe, and when the jury returned with their verdict, they announced that they had found 61-year-old Walter Shelley guilty. He was guilty of the 1969 first-degree murder of 15-year-old John McCabe. He was convicted based on the exact same evidence and testimony that Michael Ferrer's trial contained, but this time, this second jury believed the account of Edward Allen Brown. They believed that Walter Shelley was responsible for this crime. Now, initially, Walter Shelley was sentenced to life in prison. However, this was later changed because his conviction was later changed. As we know, he was initially convicted of murder in the first degree. However, the judge ultimately decided to reduce this to murder in the second degree, I guess believing that there wasn't sufficient evidence to prove that this crime was necessarily premeditated. I mean, we know that Edward Allen Brown claimed that their intent wasn't to kill John that night, just to scare him. So it was changed to second degree murder, and his sentence was reduced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years, meaning meaning that he would become eligible for parole around 2028 time, and so prison is where Walter Shelley remains today, whilst Michael Ferrer and Edward Allen Brown both remain free. John's mother, Evelyn McCabe, has since also passed away. She died in 2016, a couple of years after the trials. Prior to her death, she had actually filed a wrongful death lawsuit against all three men she alleged were responsible for her son's death, Shelley, Ferrer and Brown, and so when Evelyn died in 2016, her daughters Roberta and Debbie decided to pursue it for her. Although I'm not entirely sure what the outcome of this lawsuit was, whether it was dismissed or if they're still pursuing it to this day, I don't know. I couldn't find any recent information about that online, so yeah, I'm not sure what ended up happening with this lawsuit. But that brings us to the end of this case. That concludes the tragic case of John McCabe. A really, really upsetting crime and a real roller coaster of a case. I don't feel like I've ever covered a crime quite like this one, where there were two, technically three, alleged killers, and yet only one was convicted, despite the fact that the exact same evidence was used during both trials. So I'm really, really looking forward to reading everyone's comments and opinions on this case. Do let me know your thoughts down below, and of course let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie.